That was very enthusiastic. Thanks, Elijah. And thank you for the flexibility of the musicians to change the songs. It should serve me right for choosing a hymn outside of the hymn book. I'm going to ask that you indulge me initially for a few moments for me to spend some time expressing a confession and also some gratitude and edification before I begin the sermon. Up until October of last year, for the 4 years previous, I didn't actually enjoy coming to church that much, nor was I looking forward to it. Since July 2016, my wife and I, Alejandra, would on some occasions barely have the energy to get to church. And when we did, we were either changing nappies or feeding two boys or chasing after them, and neither of us really ever got to sit through a sermon entirely separately or by ourselves. There was one exception where I had to go to Tasmania for a hiking trip where I happened to go to Big Camp and I got to sit through a sermon entirely. And so in October last year, we started coming to this church, and after a couple of weeks, the kids were in Sabbath school and we found ourselves sitting through an entire sermon without interruption. And it was disorientating. It was a good thing, but it was very disorientating. I really enjoy Sabbath school as well, so I'd missed out on that. And so to come here and see the way Sabbath school is done in the hall there, and all of Salisbury Church, it's been a real blessing to me and us. I see the structural changes you've made to this church. And I look out on this congregation and I see people who are not based on ethnic or racial groups. That's the way we're going to worship in church, isn't it? So I'm really grateful for the way you've welcomed me and my family to this church and the experience you've given me. And I think if other people who come here willingly or invited to, or even reluctantly, if they can have the same experience that I did, I think that's a good thing. That'll be a good thing. And I thank you for one of your members who invited me persistently for up to 3 years to try and get here. And of course, my wife's saying, come and show me what a You-Go church is like. So I did come reluctantly, but I'm glad I did. Yeah. Teta Bona. Also before I begin, I want us to participate in this together. Can I ask you to ponder on the mental process the pastor or the elder, or the head elder goes through when they're choosing a sermon topic? What does the minister who's been speaking for 20 to 30 or 40 years, how does he choose a topic that you and I haven't heard 3 to 4 or 5 times before? With all the platforms we have now to listen to sermons, we as a congregation, what do we want? We'd hope that it's not a wishy-washy sermon that goes on till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We want it to be scriptural, don't we? So as I reflect on this, my response is to be far more thankful and appreciative of our pastors and head elder and elders that do stand up here willingly week to week to preach to us. And I'm grateful for that. So this morning I'm not going to pretend to be a theologian, but I'm going to claim that some of what I speak about you haven't heard about, that it is scriptural, and it may even give you an indication or give you some proximity to heaven and the new earth as well. I want to draw your attention to Mark chapter 5. Do you remember the words of Jesus to the demoniac after he'd healed him of his oppression? Go home, tell your friends how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So to use today's words, what I understand that to mean is that Jesus was saying, go share your testimony. And this is what I've chosen to preach about today. Now, I consider my testimony story to be very interesting. The way it happened, the symbolism, the grandeur, the location, and all that, it was fascinating. However, you may not find that so interesting. And that's fine, but in order for you to still participate and not tune out in this sermon, I'm going to ask you to inject your own testimony that you have as I speak and the verses and the lessons I try and take out of my own testimony, and I think you'll still get something out of it. You also may be convicted to write it down after hearing my testimony today, and I want to guarantee you that a lot more will be revealed once you put your testimony words on a page, as I have as well. Quite a few years ago, I spent about 14 months living in Switzerland. When I took 2 years off my university studies, it had been 17 years since I'd been to school, and I just had enough. I had to get out of the classroom. So I took more than the usual year, and I took 2 years off to go there. I'd wanted to go to Switzerland since I was a little boy, and at the time I had aspirations to work in child protection. So I thought I'll combine the two goals, and through an agency organised a stay in a family to be an au pair and look after the kids there for some time. Now, if there's anyone who has a desire to leave this earth and end up in the new earth and see what it's like, I reckon that Switzerland gives you a very good clue of what the new earth will be like and what to expect. That's what I thought, and that's what I still do. For those of you who are dependent on chocolate, I'm not talking about the chocolate. As my train left Lake Geneva for the first time, I started running from one side of the train wagon to the other, just looking up and not knowing what to look at, but trying to see everything. And I'm glad that it was a midday service because there was no one else on the train. And I was able to act without any inhibition. And just to give you an indication of what I mean, some of the places, if you haven't been, then if you have, you're going to enjoy it even more. So if heaven is like this, if the new earth is like this, I won't be complaining, even though we have a promise that we've never seen anything like this. And it was a privilege to be able to spend over a year living in this kind of environment. Some of you may recognise that, the Lauterbrunnen, and there's a valley there that then goes up to the Schildhorn, and then that's it there in winter time. So some of these photos were taken by a camera that probably cost $10,000, not my own, and others by maybe a $100 camera before, pre-digital. The Matterhorn, and then there's the Matterhorn again. A great place to go. And so where I lived, I can actually say that it was a picture postcard location. That's a postcard I found of the village where I lived, and the building to your left, that just, I'll point there. That building there was the house that I lived. The family had a restaurant, and I lived in that building right across from a church that was older than colonised Australia. And it took me a few months for the Catholic bells that ring every Sunday morning to not annoy me and to raise me up to take me to church. But anyway, I got used to it after a while. So, because I recall how much I enjoyed being there, I get anxious in a kind of good way when I think about the promise that we have about the new earth and how I will react when I actually do arrive to the new earth. Now, I must admit there are some things about Switzerland that aren't like heaven and aren't going to be like the new earth. And that is the whole place, most of the place smells like a barn, a stalla. I'll tell you why, yeah. When the first train door opened after I left the capital, this smell wafted in just like it did when I grew up with the barn. It wasn't too offensive, it was quite sweet. But it was the exact same smell as a barn. And the reason for that is that Switzerland has a lot of cows. They need a lot of cows to produce the milk for the chocolate they're famous for, and of course the cheese. But there's another reason why they have cows, and they have cows that fight. And these are large black female cows that they get into ring together to try and push each other out. And the cows that have a winning record, they're actually worth thousands and thousands of dollars. So upwards of 15 to 20,000 francs. Which is just a little bit more in Australian dollars. But you only have to leave the valleys and start walking and climbing into the mountains to leave all that sweet smell behind. And it was on one of those walks into the mountain that I had a particular experience, an experience that was not that significant at the time, but became so when I remembered, and I recounted it when I'd returned back to Australia. And it was my journey to the cross. At the time it was happening, I was too absorbed with the environment around me to understand the lesson that I was living in the moment. And I wasn't a Christian at the time either. Myself and some other Australians and an American who were living in proximity to each other at the time, we were living in Sion, which is a French part of Switzerland, who, just for reference, it's a city that lost their bid to the Winter Olympics in 2006, took the train into the mountains to a village called Grion to spend a weekend there, staying at a YHA operated by Australians as well. When we got there, it was cloudy, so we didn't see what the scenery was around us. But it cleared up on the second day, and we decided to spend the day walking up to the top of a hill that had got our attention from the hostel. So the hill was most definitely over 2,000 metres high. The village itself was about 1,200 metres in altitude. So our destination was somewhere in Australia. You'd be in the clouds if you tried to do the same, with the exception of Mount Kosciuszko, of course. After walking blissfully for 2 to 3 hours, we began to cross fences and follow cow hoof prints rather than a path, which had disappeared by that time. We went around that last corner and we got to see what was around the corner. Forgive me, I had to take photos of paper photos because I didn't have a digital camera. So this is what we found. We were lost, but why would you be distressed when you come across to this side? And that's a hamlet there that was not inhabited at the time. I think it's used in wintertime because there's ski fields there, or maybe during the summer, but there was no one there. And we found that mountain abruptly blocking our path, and we had no idea where we were, which direction to go to, but we were still not worried. We were intoxicated by our surroundings. And I know that this is what my focus was on, not the actual state of being lost. However, reality is not overcome or intimidated by denial. Sooner or later, you've got to stop pretending that the problem's going to solve itself. And I realised we had to find a way back, and I was feeling somewhat responsible for our situation because it had been mostly my idea to go on this walk. As I looked around and upwards, guess what I saw? There was a cross on top of a ridge way above us, and it was illuminated by the afternoon sun. So I suggested to the others, why don't we head towards that cross? There's shadows were starting to cast themselves around me and near us, and we really had nowhere else to go. Going back was not an option. So we started heading towards the cross through another fence and through brush and scrub and up steep hillside that we had to walk on our hands and knees. We got to the top one at a time, and the last part of the trip you had to walk along a narrow ridge where there was mostly shale. And the last person, she slipped over and fell down and nearly fell off, and was quite upset when she reached us, because if she had fallen, we wouldn't have seen where she would have landed, and she was very, very concerned about that situation. Anyway, she forgave us eventually. But when we got to the top and to the cross, we realised that this cross was actually the location we'd been looking at from the hostel. We'd ended up at the destination that we had aspired to and tried to get to, despite not seeing the cross from the hostel. We looked down, the valley we're in was completely in shadow. And it reminded me, this has happened many times to me, when I'm in a valley and the shadows start to come and I realise I'm lost, it really sobers me up very quickly. And it's happened quite a few times here in Australia. But there's something about that really speaks to me. Now, there's no fabulous, marvellous story at the mountaintop or a testimony where I converted myself or the other people around me who were non-believers. There was no bright light, no vision for me. I marvelled at the landscape, took some photos, and I unfortunately turned my back on that place with my pride no less stubborn and my heart no less open to the still small voice. It was a nice though long walk back to Grion that afternoon. But after that, I regularly noticed crosses on high places on mountaintops where I lived and when I travelled around the Swiss countryside. I started to wonder, apart from the obvious reason, why were there crosses there? Why did people go to so much trouble to put them in some obscure places? And what had happened to motivate the people responsible to do that? To the cross, to us, the Christian, is central to our lives and our beliefs. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2:2, "For I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified." I'm not going to put the verses up on the screen. I'd invite you to look up in your own Bibles or whatever else you use as I quote the text yourselves. I want to consider responses to 3 questions this morning, not just ask them. What do we bring to the cross? What do we leave at the cross? And what do we take from it? So that I want to tell you what I brought, left and took from the cross myself. But first, a bit of a reminder about the cross itself. In Matthew 27:35, "And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. Now, it's pretty obvious, but it's worthwhile saying out loud. When Christ was on the cross, he didn't have his clothes on him. They were down on the ground, being torn up or being split up amongst the people, the soldiers around there. In John chapter 19, verse 17 to 18, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. So crucifixion, we're all familiar with that, aren't we? It was a punishment that was inflicted from time immemorial by the ancients. It wasn't new to the Romans. And it was common among the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Carthaginians, the Macedonians. Alexander the Great was a fan of it. And the Romans. The Greeks were opposed to it, but there is a record of the Athenians crucifying a Persian general. But generally they didn't use that too often. And it was probably the Romans that introduced it to the Jews. And before the Jews became subject to the Romans, they used hanging. They never used crucifixion, solely hanging as a punishment. Because that punishment was the dreadful of all others, both for the shame and the pain of it. And it was so scandalous that it was used as a mark of loathing on the vilest and depraved of criminals. It was a punishment of robbers and murderers, provided they were slaves. If they were free or citizens, it wasn't used for them. A historian called Horace refers to the punishment of crucifixion, and from what he has recorded, it seems to be inflicted just on slaves, not on free people. And then but there were some Romans who were not into it that much as well. Cicero, for example, who was a politician, a ruler, and an academic, he said, for example, and described crucifixion as a most cruel and disgusting punishment. So it wasn't something that the Romans all were for, and it was recognisable amongst them that it was not a pleasant punishment. So what do we bring to the cross? I'm going to quote John 5:44 in two versions. John 5:44 from the English Standard Version and from the NLT version. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? No wonder and then from the NLT, no wonder you can't believe. For you gladly honour each other, but you don't care about the honour that comes from the one and only God. The Pharisees and scribes and probably the whole Sanhedrin, with the exception of perhaps Joseph and Nicodemus, were there at Golgotha that day. And yet their sole response was ridicule and contempt. The grand obstacle to the salvation of the Pharisees and the scribes was their pride, vanity, and self-love. They lived on each other's praise. If they acknowledged Jesus as the true teacher, they would have had to give up the status and the good opinion of the masses and their peers. So they choose to lose their souls rather than give up the reputation of their peers and the other men around them. We generally don't wish this, but won't this be the fate of millions who connect worldly honour and religion, and if they were connected, they would be faithful. But as the kingdom of Christ is not of this world, and their hearts and minds are joined to the earth, they will not accept the salvation offered to them, which are on Jesus' terms, and he has terms that are non-negotiable. And those terms are deny thyself, take up thy cross, and follow me. So it's no wonder that we don't find persons making any progress in Christian life who mix with the world and in whatever respect conform their conduct and behaviour with the anti-Christian customs, principles and fashions. And I could relate to that for a long time myself. Galatians 5:24. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have nailed the passions and desires of their sinful nature to his cross and crucified them there. We can't come to the cross until we recognise and accept our need for Christ, because we will not come. The cross is too much of a rebuke to our selfish self. And it blatantly shows what it requires of us and why it was required. And that is that it took someone else to overcome and to be victorious, to defeat sin and to justify us, to make us right with God, in other words. And it wasn't something that we could accomplish of ourselves, nor claim as our own victory. Perhaps this is what the term the shame of the cross means. And I know for a long time this twisted kind of meaning was evident in the attitude, the way that I lived. This is a devastating reality and a truth to be denied and deconstructed by the humanist and the postmodernist, and the heart that's so full of pride and bursting at the seams with self-esteem. There is no room in the minds and hearts of such for the humility, the confession and repentance, and the justice that was displayed at the cross by Jesus the whole night before his crucifixion and in the 3.5 years before that night. So what do we bring to the cross? We bring ourself and our death to self. And in Galatians 2:20, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless, yet I live. Not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. But we have to read verse 21 as well. I do not frustrate the grace of God, for if righteousness is attainable by the law, then Christ hath died in vain. So what do we leave at the cross? In Matthew 16:25, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. So that is, shall wish to save his life at the expense of their conscience and casting aside the cross, he will lose it. It's obvious to see then how necessary it is to put aside self. But whatsoever a man loses in this world for his steady attachment to Christ and his cause, he shall have abundantly made up to him in heaven. Are any of you familiar with the vision that Ellen White has where she's asked, not just herself, but herself and others are asked in the new earth, what it was like for the people, by people who died way before the second coming, what it was like during the end time, and what the living saints had endured in those times. Hers and the others' response was that heaven is cheap enough. Because after comparing what they went through to being in the new earth, it did not seem worth comparing. So what do we leave at the cross? The old man, the old woman, and only to get life in return. What do we take from the cross? Matthew 10:38. And he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. So this is a verse that we usually recite when we talk about denying self. And it is saying that, but there's a little bit more to it. The words of Jesus in this verse are, the person who isn't ready, after my example, to suffer death in the cause of my religion is not worthy of me and does not deserve to be called my disciple. And this alludes to the custom of making every criminal carry his own cross to the place of execution. And there's a quote there in John 9:19-17 where it talks about him, he bearing his cross went forth into the place of the skull, Golgotha. But there's a couple more things that we take from the cross as well. In Romans 8:15 in the KJV version, for ye have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but ye have received the spirit of adoption. And that's that second part that I want to focus on, where we cry, Abba, Father. Notice there's two words, Sirach, and from the Greek being used there, Abba and Father. And the NLT version says, so you do not have received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's spirit when he adopted you as his own children. We are brought into God's family by adoption. And the agent that brings us there is the Holy Spirit. Adoption was an act that was frequent in Roman times, and they had a whole system of legislation and laws about where one person would move from one family to another. Very similar to what we have today. You and I would all be very familiar with how adoption works. And it's really important that we understand, and I'm going to leave the responsibility to you to take on that meaningfully, that this was not just a nice idea or concept, but there was a legal process that occurred that we're adopted by God and we can now call ourselves his children. Think about this and consider if it's scripturally or doctrinally sound to you in order to make this more meaningful to yourself. The lawgiver chooses to take the conviction and the penalty of the lawbreaker so that the lawbreaker can avoid the ultimate penalty and then also have access to the privilege of one who has only ever been a lawkeeper. In John chapter 1, verses 11-12, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. So the children of God have the right to eternal life in the new earth, and we take with us this right by being adopted into God as children of God. We also, in 1 Corinthians 1 chapter 17, for Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to preach the good news, and not with clever speech, for fear that the cross of Christ would lose its power. So the Apostle Paul was sent simply to use plain and simple language to proclaim the truth, and that was that Christ was crucified for the sin of the world. And the whole point of this was so that there would be no chance or excuse that Paul's eloquence or his character would be used as a reason for all the conversions. So from the cross, we take that we have a legal right to heaven and that we are God's children, and the commission to spread the good news. It's at the cross that we meet Jesus. It is there that he says with a smile on his face, "Finally, you made it. I've been reaching out to you, trying to get your attention with the Christian parents I gave you, with the Christian education and all the church attendances your body attended. I was there. Now let me take that burden off your back that you've been carrying in exchange for my burden, my cross." At 18 years of age, my conscious response to this was, why should I give up my bag of rocks I've been carrying? This is my independence, my pride, my self-control, and my resentments. I'm going to do it without you. I don't need to give that up. So I carried my box of rocks for years. And this, of course, reminds us of the rich young ruler, doesn't it? We can all respond like that young man. We belong to the top 1% of the globe's wealthy at the moment. We must be the wealthiest Christians materialistically and in terms of liberty since the beginning of time in our Western world. We aren't being burned at the stake, forced to live in caves, nor are we persecuted. But for the rich young ruler, his bag of rocks was so valuable that they prevented him from seeing what Christ was offering him. It's always time to do away with that which stands in our approach to the cross. And I've talked about self enough. But what about some of those sentimental obstructions or sins, the things that I'm holding on to? I have a disease called sentimentalism, I would say, where I hold on to treasures and things that are meaningful to me since I could remember. I've got sticks and bits of paper and toys and things that I relate to that I have in a treasure box, and I can't let them go. And similarly, from the old life, I no longer participated in those things. It was easy to stop listening to the music I did, wearing the clothes I did, and doing the things of that time. But I still kept some of the artifacts of that time because there was value and I hadn't let go. But then I realised that I was cherishing that which I could not take to heaven. And every now and then I'd be impressed by a still small voice. It's time to surrender all that you have, Tim. You can't take that up to heaven. You can't fit it through the gates. Look at me on the cross, nothing, naked, exposed. I was abandoned. So unless you wish to remain here, I want to give you everything. Little measures up to the question, is this bringing me closer to heaven or is it distancing me and distracting me? And will I get through heaven's customs office with this stuff that I'm carrying? Do we really think that we're going to have a suitcase to take with us when we get into heaven to carry all these things that we're holding on to? I had to apply the last part of verse 2 from Romans 12, verses 1 to 2, where it's discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. It wasn't until I realised what happened at Golgotha in an intimate and personal way that I was able to bring all that I thought I needed, allowed myself to be found, and listened to Jesus say, you don't need all that stuff. I want to give you everything, not take away. Just trust me. To guide you, ask for power, there will be more mountains to climb. Jesus wants us to go and tell others to follow. He says to you and I need you. Look at my hands. I can't come back until you've told others. I need you here in this world while I'm not here. Pray for the Holy Spirit to fill you with love and my purposes. Because others need to know that I can offer them all they've dreamed about. So go home, tell your friends, God has found me, blessed me, and healed me of my personal form of leprosy. Here is one of his children saying it's too good to miss. He's calling those who want to march, who are lost, without hope, to look up at the cross. Those who are smug and self-satisfied in their righteousness to get real. And for those who lack assurance in the whole cross thing, you're an heir of salvation. You've been purchased of God, and you've been offered forgiveness. You've been reborn spiritually and given a new name. In response to the question I wondered earlier about what happened about all the crosses being put up around the place, around Switzerland. The answer for myself is that a long time ago, Christ carried a cross up a hill far away. And as a result, when I was lost, I was also able to climb a mountain towards a cross that was before me. And in reaching that cross, I also